Hello, and welcome to the Ocean News Podcast, an audio series taking you through the breaking news and the biggest stories from the Oceanographic newsroom. I'm Rob Hutchins, news editor here at Oceanographic magazine, and in this episode, I'll be leading us on a deeper dive into the waters of the South African coastline, where this week new hopes have been raised for the ongoing effort to bring the African penguin back from the brink of extinction. Yes, victory has been hard fought and won this week, giving South African conservation groups cause to celebrate, because after years of battling, an agreement has finally now been reached to establish and strengthen no fishing zones around 6 crucial breeding colonies for African penguins around the South African coastline. From this week, sardine and anchovy fishing will no longer be allowed in the waters of up to 20 kilometers around penguin colonies on both Robben Island and Bird Island, with limited closures extended to 4 other critical sites for breeding African penguins. The agreement has been held up as a major win for conservationists and for the species alike, whose population has been in freefall since 2018, with the blame being largely directed at the destruction of habitats and depletion of food sources, primarily at the hands of commercial fishing in the area. Together, the 6 closures will work to secure what conservationists have long been fighting for: biologically secure, meaningful foraging areas for the species in each of the West Coast, Southern Cape and Algoa Bay regions, and a concerted effort to bring the species back from the brink of extinction. This is a story that brings conservation efforts in line, perhaps for the first time in South African waters, with local and commercial fishing needs. Debate has been raging for years over how much commercial fishing has contributed to the African penguin population's decline, as well as what impact fishing restrictions would have on the rescue attempts. Conservationists have long argued that dramatic declines in local food sources, fueled by competition from commercial fishing practices close to the African penguin's breeding colonies, has been the root cause of the sharp decline in species numbers now living in the wild. Over the course of 6 years, from 2018 to 2023, breeding pairs of the African penguin plummeted from 15,187 to a devastating estimate of just 8,750. It was a threshold breached that put the species well into the IUCN Red List classification of critically endangered, raising deep concern that the species could, on this current downward trajectory, become extinct within the decade. That would mean by the year 2035, there would be no more African penguins found in the wild. In March last year, however, the environmental NGO BirdLife South Africa decided to take the plight of the African penguin to court, where, represented by the Biodiversity Law Centre, the group sought to hold South Africa's Environment Minister, Deon George, to account to his obligations to mitigate the threat posed by sardine and anchovy fishing to the world's African penguin population. With this week's agreement settled, it would appear Minister George is ready to meet those obligations, with no fishing zones now secured across the 6 key areas for African penguin breeding and feeding. Not only this, but the landmark agreement will also ensure that the South African Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment has to renew the closure permits each January for the next 10 years. This is a period that will prove fateful for the species facing extinction within that same timeframe, with firm and decisive action to rescue them not to be taken. The outcome of the court case is a vast improvement on what stood by way of protection for the African penguin before. It's true that the 6 breeding colonies highlighted by the South African conservation groups support over 3/4 of the world's remaining African penguin population, spanning Dasson Island, Robben Island, Stony Point, Dyer Island, St. Croix Island, and Bird Island. Prior to this week's win, it was the case that only 4 of these areas offered some level of protection from fishing, and those protections covered less than 50% of the penguin's core feeding grounds. BirdLife South Africa and the local NGO, the Southern African Foundation for the Conservation of Coastal Birds, or SANCCOB for short, had previously called such protections biologically meaningless. The result this week, then, is a first step of many towards putting in place the right kind of protections and in the right areas, ushering in perhaps a new dawn for the fate of the African penguin after all. Nikki Stander, head of conservation at SANCOB, says, however, that the fight is far from over. She recognises that the threats facing the African penguin are both complex and ongoing, and that the order granted this week itself will require constant monitoring and continued cooperation from the industry and the government. Meanwhile, speaking at a press conference this week, Kate Handley, Executive Director of the Biodiversity Law Centre, those representing environmental NGOs in the court hearing this week, had this to say.
The imposition of scientifically informed fishing closures to limit commercial purse seine, anchovy and sardine fishing activities around these key island breeding colonies is a long overdue step towards securing their survival in the wild. We now look to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment and the Minister to ensure full implementation of this order and to follow through on taking all necessary steps to protect the African penguin. Doing so is not only important for the well-being and survival of this iconic species, but is critical to ensure that our ocean ecosystem is protected for the benefit of future generations.
Of course, overfishing in the feeding grounds of African penguins is a major issue impacting population numbers, but so too are the species' currently critically low reproduction rates. In further efforts to support the African penguin population, SANCOB recently launched what it calls its Chick Bolstering Project, a mission to rescue, rehabilitate and release abandoned African penguin chicks. Since 2006, over 10,000 chicks have been rescued with an impressive 81% release rate. Right now, SANCOB is caring for a group of 85 African penguin chicks, preparing them for release when they are strong enough, while an additional 40 eggs are being incubated, meaning more penguins will soon bolster wild populations. These may seem like small numbers, but with a population now below 10,000 in the wild, every African penguin on this pathway towards the restoration of a species on the brink of extinction counts. It makes all the more important then the agreement now in place to ensure that when these chicks are released, they will be returned to a thriving ecosystem where fishing activity works to support all of those that rely on the bounty that a well-managed and cared-for ocean can provide. If you'd like to learn more about this story or other stories on the plight and the rescue attempts made for the African penguin, head to the Oceanographic Newsroom. This has been the Ocean News Podcast. I've been Rob Hutchins. Thank you for listening.